Welcome back to the second half of the Politics and Media Show. The government has said it will try and overcome a defeat in the House of Lords last week over plans to cap benefits for households. The coalition government wants to restrict the amount to which a household can receive to £26,000 a year. The measure is part of the Welfare Reform Bill, which has been put before the Lords last week. The bill is now set to return to the Commons after peers voted to exclude child benefit from the overall cap. The proposals have been criticised by a number of welfare and family groups who are concerned about the potential impact on families, and children in particular, as the following report explains.
Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg has said ministers will seek to overturn a Lord's defeat for plans to cap benefits for households at £26,000 when the bill returns to the Commons. The Welfare Reform Bill looks set to ping-pong between the two chambers after peers voted to exclude child benefit from the overall cap. Ministers say that would raise the cap to the take-home pay of someone on a £50,000 salary, making it pointless. Former party leader Lord Ashdown was among 26 Lib Dem peers to rebel. The peer said that as president of the United Nations Children Agency UNICEF, he couldn't back the government's plans in their current form. But Lib Dem leader Nick Clegg said last week that he was a strong supporter of the cap, arguing that it's fair to say you can't receive more in benefits than if you were to earn £35,000 before tax. He added that he will stick to that principle and make sure that any amendments in the Lords which make that impossible will be reversed. But groups in opposition to the proposed benefit reforms have deep concerns. They worry about the impact any changes would have on families, women and minority groups in particular. They say it's the most vulnerable who will suffer.
With me in the studio to discuss this is Dawn Butler, who's a former Labour Minister for Youth, Citizens and Youth Engagement. Welcome to the show. We did also invite someone from the Department for Work and Pensions to appear, but they declined to provide a minister. So in the absence of the opposition, how disastrous do you think the Welfare Reform Bill will be for the poor if this goes through?
I think on two levels it's quite disastrous in that it would actually increase the amount that taxpayers will have to pay in terms of the welfare bill in the future. And it's also more importantly disastrous because the effect that it will have on especially Muslim families and Catholic families are huge. And I'll explain that a little more. I mean, the department has already said they've done their own research, their impact assessment, and what they've said is that 80% of the families that will be affected by this change will lose about £190 a week, and the families will have more than 3 children. Now, if you take Brent, my constituency where I live, those families who have more than 3 children are in the main domain, they are Muslim families and Catholic families, but mainly Muslim families are top of the bill that have more than 3 children in their households. So they are the ones that will be directly affected by this bill. And part of the communities and local government report that they did also cited Brent as in the top 5 boroughs that will be affected, as well as Newham, Tower Hamlets, all of the main areas that we know where Black and Asian families are. So this is a disaster on many levels because, okay, the headlines look fair, you know, why should you earn more on benefits than you would if you were working? Everybody intrinsically will say, well, okay, that's a fair point. But actually, when you delve a little bit deeper into the detail, you realise that you are choking, if you like, these family support mechanism. We're going to go back to the days where families had 1 meal a day in their household, and we don't want to go back to that.
Let's just take apart that headline figure, because I think that's the one that kind of gets the attention. People say £26,000 a year, and most people say, oh, £26,000 per month. Not too bad. But I mean, £26,000 per, that's per household. So that could be 2 people working their guts out and getting £13,000 a year each, which is pretty poor wages. And even if you add it together, 26,000 is what, 1,000 below the average income in London. So so when you actually begin to look at this, it's not exactly, you know, as appalling as the proponents of the bill like to pretend.
Absolutely, it's not a huge figure. I mean, remember when Labour came in, they promised that they would bring in a minimum wage to help households get above a certain state of living, so that they have a certain, not lifestyle, but just be able to survive. And what this government's actually doing is dragging people back down. And is that the kind of society where we want to live in? It isn't. It goes against the British principles of what we've kind of fought for and what we believe in. And so, yeah, £26,000 isn't a huge amount of money. But as you say, that could be a family of two. But it could also be 2 adults and 5 children. And you're taking away almost £190 a week. That's how much they're likely to lose.
Yeah, let's talk about that impact assessment a minute, because I think the reason why that's become an important figure in the debate is because this is an impact assessment carried out by the department itself.
Absolutely.
So nobody can say this is special pleading by an NGO.
Absolutely.
And is that, you've been a minister, is that unusual for a figure generated by the department itself to enter into the public debate at this stage in this way?
I can tell you, when the minister looked at that impact assessment, they were shocked. I can tell you that, because no minister in their department puts forward legislation that they think publicly will come out in this way, that they will get a report that will be out in the public domain that says 90,000 adults will be affected by this policy and 220,000 children will be affected by this policy. And I'm sure the minister looked at that and thought, oh my God, this is shocking. And they probably hoped that it will slip through because they've got this headline, why should you be earning the equivalent of somebody earning £36,000? And what you'll also always hear is that they say, well, we've got public opinion on our side. Well, you cannot segregate the public from real people. The public are real people. The public are those families who have more than 3 children. The public are those families where one person's out working. There are people in Brent. I know there's a man who does security work, goes out to work 4 o'clock in the morning. He has 5 children. They get child tax credits. They get working tax credits. They get those allowances. They're probably over that. But he's working. They're in a house. They're overcrowded. He's trying to make a better life for him and his family. And you're basically letting them suffer.
What's the process now? The bill has been knocked back in the Lords. Do you think the government has got the kind of enthusiasm for this to drive it through the Commons despite the rejections in the Lords?
I think everything that goes to show from what they've said is that they will overrule and override the Lords' position. Now, there's something called ping pong where it will go backwards and forwards, and this can go in well into the night. I've been there when that's happened, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning. But ultimately, the House of Commons has superiority over the Houses of Lords, and so they can ultimately overrule the House of Lords' decision. It very rarely happens. And the reason being is because the House of Lords are full of people who have more time, quite honestly, to go through a bill in detail, scrutinise it, talk about it, debate it, and give a unique perspective on it. And they have more time to do that rather than the House of Commons. So when you override something that the House of Lords have said, actually this is wrong, because you're forcing people into poverty, you're forcing people into crime, you're forcing people to do things that they don't want to do. It's a very dangerous, I think, situation that this government has put themselves in.
So do you think between the kind of position that they're in parliamentary terms, having to force the bill through the Commons in the face of opposition in the Lords, and the sort of mounting criticism of the bill outside Parliament, how do you think they could lose the bill?
I think they could lose the bill, but I think that they're very brazen about it. I can tell you, Nick Clegg, if he was on the other side, if he wasn't deputy leader, there's no way on earth he would be saying, well, I believe in this bill. And he wouldn't be saying that. And those Lib Dems who have especially Catholics and Muslims in their constituency should be hanging their heads in shame, because what they're doing to those families is disgraceful, and they really should be hanging their heads in shame. Most areas, like Brent, for instance, they have 25,000 people on the waiting list, on the housing waiting list. This bill is going to ensure, and this is the own government's impact assessment, there's going to be an additional 20,000 people going to be made homeless. That's on top of the 20,000 people that will be made homeless from the housing, changes in the housing bill. So that's an extra 40,000 people that are going to be made homeless. How can we have a government that drives policies like that through?
Do you think there's a moment here where perhaps people would be wise to sit back and reflect about the possible consequences of pushing a bill through this? And I'm thinking this in terms of the debate that took place around the riots. You see, people are very keen to look at the immediate cause of the riots, to single out the people on the video, but what they don't see is the months, perhaps even years before, where bills like this have been going through and degrading the social fabric in the areas.
That is the most fundamental point that anybody can make, is it takes years. When you put bills and policies through, sometimes the assessment talks about doing a post-legislative work where you look at how the bill affects people in reality. And what they're saying is you normally do this after 4 years, but you might have to do this after a longer period of time. Now that's because the devastating effect that will have on families, it won't manifest itself immediately, but in 5-10 years' time, you are going to see the effects of bills like this. And not just those bills, the education bills, the housing bills, the bills on... This bill also caps people who suffer from cancer and the support, the financial support that they receive from cancer. And it's a known fact, the research that I've done on cancer, especially breast cancer in Muslim women and black women, is that they present later and they're more likely to suffer from cancer. So they would use this benefit more. And so all of these bills are just going to destroy a whole generation. And I think this is going to be the first generation where parents, they used to say, I'd like my child to do better than I did. This will be the first generation where the parents cannot guarantee that their child is going to have a better future or a better job than they did.
And as you say, it's not the only bill we're considering, and you were mentioning the housing bill there. How, because when they're presented politically, we look at them one by one and you assess the argument one by one, but of course the effect out there in the society is cumulative. So how do you see, say, the housing bill and this bill interacting? What will it look like on the ground when the provisions of these bills become enacted?
You may call me cynical, but I think this is systematically... This government is set out to destroy a certain group of people in our society. Systematically, they have set out to do this through the education, through housing, through welfare. They are systematically destroying people that I care about. The bankers are fine. They can turn down their £1 million bonuses and, and they're not going to lose a minute's sleep over that. They're fine. But those people who it really matters, the reason why politics is supposed to, the people that politics is supposed to be there for, they're the ones that are going to suffer. And I think it's fundamental and it's systematic of this government. And I think it's literally destroying our society. I mean, I tried to do a spider graph, and I just couldn't work it. It was just such a mess. I think it needs somebody a bit more than... I think I need some help to do this spider graph in terms of, the devastating effect that it's having on our society.
Well, we may have to find the help outside the Treasury. But what about the government's argument that all this is necessary because we've got to cut the deficit? I mean, everything here is always justified in these terms. Do you buy that?
I agree that we have to cut the deficit, or we have to get the deficit under control. Absolutely agree that we have to find a way to do that. But how do we do that? I've never known anybody or any books that I've read that says you can cut your way out of a recession. Every book that I've read, there's always the hindsight bit at the end that says, in hindsight, we should have invested more. We should have invested more in jobs. People should have paid into their taxes. I mean, if you remember at the Conservative conference, Cameron was going to come out with the, if you were in debt with your credit card, you pay off your credit card, and all the economics, all the people were saying, oh no, you can't do that actually, because that will destroy economically the country. So he had to change that in his speech because it was economically incompetent as a proposal. So you know, basically, yes, we have to get the deficit under control, but you don't do that by putting more people in poverty. You don't do that by putting more people on the dole, which is what he's doing. The reason why the welfare bill is growing is because more people are becoming unemployed, because you are making 70,000 civil servants unemployed. Those civil servants provide a public service. We're having fewer public service, fewer police on the streets means that we're having more crime. I've been burgled twice and I've had my bag stolen. So I'm talking from personal experience. So crime is on the increase, and that's because you're having less police officers, less people that are doing those jobs. So it's all very much systematic. And, you know, I think we will look back in 2 years' time and we won't realise what this government has done, and it will take years to undo this work. And I just hope that this bill is defeated, because when I was an MP, I remember families coming to me and they're already overcrowded, they're already paying too much, and I fear what will happen to them next and what will happen to those young people next, because I know that they won't have jobs to go to. The school and education's getting worse in some cases. So I know that a lot of them, unfortunately, will turn to crimes, and we will probably have, you can say I predicted it, we will probably have a riot, another riot, and it will be a worse riot.
Don't you think, wouldn't the opposition, wouldn't the Labour opposition be in a stronger place if it made more of that case, because the evidence is arriving on a daily basis? Instead of saying, we basically accept the cuts, but you're doing it wrong, this week they could turn around and say, hey, look at the United States. The economy's just jumped by 2.6%.
Yeah.
Our economy's just slumped by 0.3%. Surely investing your way out of the recession is a better answer.
Absolutely, I agree. I think what happened was Labour tried to make that point and they weren't being listened to. They were being shouted down at every opportunity. So they kind of changed tact, if you want, and found another. You know, I'm a very straight talking kind of person, so I will just tell it as I see it from experiences and from what I know and from what I believe to be the answer. And the answer isn't what Osborne and Cameron are presenting. That is not the answer. When Osborne said, I have no plan B, it just to me shows their arrogance. It's a very arrogant government that we have at the moment, and we need to kind of not be scared of telling them that they're arrogant, because they are. And we need to kind of stand up to them and say, well, actually, this is the effects that you're having on our communities. And we basically have to say no. And we can start by actually kicking Boris out of City Hall, because he's just adding to it. You know, when they want, they'll give him a bung, you know, give him some money and say, OK, we'll give you some money to pay for the rail link or stuff, you know. And I just think they think that we're stupid.
Do you think it's a harder target with Boris, though? Because the Tories don't even try to be Tories when they're Mayor of London, because they know it don't work. So there is investment. Actually, there is a kind of mini Keynesianism goes on. And that's a kind of harder target, isn't it?
Oh, it is. And Boris is brilliant at it. Boris is brilliant. He's the most non-Tory Tory that I know, and he's great, and he's funny, and he's a wordsmith, and he's intelligent. And, you know, basically you hardly ever hear from him. You know, you never see him. He doesn't say much. It's a superb strategy, you know, because the more he says, the more he puts his foot in it, and the more you realise that he doesn't actually know very much about London. But these cuts will affect London. You know, 80%, 90,000 adults in London will be affected by these cuts. 220,000 children will be affected by these cuts in London. These cuts affect London, and Boris should be standing up and saying, well, actually, this is affecting Londoners. These are affecting the people that I represent as the Mayor of London, and I say that things need to change. But he's not doing that.
What do you think? Just let me ask you one last question about the economic impact, because there's one other thing going on in the economy that we've been talking throughout the programme about, the impact of the cuts. But there's considerable inflation in the economy now. Real wages are declining in this country for only the second time since the Second World War. So many families, many working families, are getting this both ends. They're having their services cut and their real wages are declining. Does this, in your mind, justify the trade union criticism of the Labour leadership. Len McCluskey, the leader of the biggest union in the country, said, you're not dealing with it right. You need a more radical answer, not a more conservative answer.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I actually agree that Labour's kind of getting it wrong with the trade unions and the approach to the trade unions. And I think that is basically, as I say, trying to segregate public from polling and views, I think, is muddying the water because the unions are not wrong. You know, they're not always right and they don't always go about it the right way. But the unions are not wrong because what the unions see is what they had to fight in Thatcher years, and they see us going back to that. And maybe they have the hindsight of that already. And what they don't want to do is see their members suffer in that way. And as you say, they're getting it from both ends because they're getting, you know, as you say, a reduction in their wages. They're getting an increase in fares travelling to work. So, you know, they're almost making a loss, you know, already and struggling to make ends meet. And so what they're doing is trying to fight for their future and their children's future. Okay. And the only way you can fight that ever is as a collective.
OK. Dawn Butler, thanks very much for that overview of the debate about the Welfare Reform Bill, and no doubt we'll be returning to that issue in future editions of the Politics and Media Show. Do join us next week.